Hi, I'm Scott Beaulier, host of EconVersations and director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. Tonight we have on our show Judson Edwards, Dean of the Sorrell College of Business here at Troy University, my boss, and someone who's going to talk to us tonight about the new servitude that we're experiencing in America. And by servitude, what he's talking about is well, we'll let him get into what exactly he's talking about, but essentially it has to do with man's relationship and interaction with government and what it's doing to us as individuals and as people who respond to incentives, how our incentives are changing as government handouts become more prevalent. Dean Edwards, welcome.
Thank you, Scott. Good to be here.
Great to have you. You wrote an opinion editorial recently for the Birmingham News that received a fair amount of attention, a lot of comments, if you looked at the comments after the op-ed, and you described this new servitude that is part of the 21st century. Can you describe to our viewers what exactly you mean by the new servitude?
Sure. I guess I'll begin with what triggered my editorial. Is usually some news event, or I'm not always writing editorials as part of what I do, but there'll be a topic that will spur my thoughts. And on this day, I was actually at the beach and watching television and CNN, and there was one of the reporters, and I wish I could remember his name, but he was interviewing a sitting senator that was making comments of they asked, what can government do to create jobs? And of course, I'm waiting for the response of, just move out of the way and let the private sector create the jobs, because government doesn't create jobs. They may create positions within government, but that's not a sustainable model because they're depending on the private sector for the revenue to keep those government employees there. So then that started this long explanation of all of these new spending bills that were surely going to create the jobs in the economy. And it made me reflect at that moment on de Tocqueville when he was talking about this new form of servitude. And it just struck me as this is on us. Yeah. And I guess it was a fear that I'd felt through the years of seeing it go through. Really, it's generational change. Of where if you look back, I was born in the 70s and really a child of the 80s, that you saw, I remember being with my mother in lines of gas lines once of, wow, not being able to get gas in a 1978 Ford LTD, which needed a lot of gas. And so what I do remember was kind of the influx of the conservative movement in the 80s, of where it was really empowering the individual. And so I was born of that generation. And when I saw this, this on the news, and it just made me fear that we've had generations of people coming up now that really have been products of decades of government policy. That, as de Tocqueville explains in his new form of servitude, it's not anything that you really see very large on the surface. It's something that's beneath the surface that gets into, really, it's ingrained in the individual, so that the mentality of the individual is to look to government to solve the problems. If there are issues in the economy, then of course the obvious place to look is to government to solve that problem. If there's a banking, problems with the bank, let's look to the Federal Reserve. If there, and my fear in this is that the American people, as we look forward to solutions to the problems that we have, are naturally looking to government to fix the problem. And so I think is in the editorial that I put forward was, I'm very fearful that we're now that nation that de Tocqueville was warning us against. My interest has always been in rural communities and small communities, and really that's what de Tocqueville's piece did, was go out into the countryside to see what people were doing in churches and communities, and just admiring the American spirit that was built on the individual, and how the individual then built communities, and individuals built businesses that employed the community. I just feel that there's something in the American now that we're losing that individual spirit. And so that was really what motivated me, that are there actually Americans sitting out there believing the government has a solution to this problem? Because it's not going to be the government that employs people, it'll be the private sector that employs people. So the perspective is skewed, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, you talk about two real challenges to America in the piece, and you say that one of them is this idea that government can solve problems, and this faith that if a market downturn happens, as we're seeing now with the European crisis, the immediate reaction has now become, we have to intervene, we have to do something. And you say that actually the government is causing a lot of these problems. They're exacerbating them by intervening and messing up market signals. A theme that John Allison a few weeks ago was talking about when he visited campus in relation to the Fed, saying every time that the Federal Reserve was intervening, they were distorting signals because they were saving some, not saving others, and market participants couldn't sort that out. Is your recommendation then in part to just provide, the government should maybe provide a smooth playing field and then just stay out of the way? That's kind of where that takes you, right?
Well, I think the first piece is if you're going to look to I think give the private sector more, I guess, confidence in their ability to invest, is to give a little more certainty to the marketplace. You know, it seems like most of the policies that we're seeing now are focused on short-term solutions, and for the majority of these companies, they're looking for investments that will be longer-term investments. And so by creating that uncertainty in the marketplace, all you're doing is asking the private sector to really hold back until they see what will happen. With us being on the verge of another election a year from now, it could change the landscape there as well. So, I believe, Scott, that what we're facing is just you have so many things converging at once. You have the technological age of where you have this instantaneous information, and so now we have consumers and companies alike that are just getting blasted with information every day. So you're trying to make, at least if you believe in the market, of making educated decisions in the marketplace, and every day, you can check the internet or check your phone, and you can see the latest headline that's discouraging you from spending money today, or it's just a different, I guess the atmosphere where we're spending money or trying to make investment decisions is clouded with information many times. We hope to have the best information we can have, but sometimes it can just be clouded by media bias and other things that we receive. But ingrained in I think even deeper than that, when we look at what is happening in the economy today, it is policy that in many ways created the housing crisis that we're in, as Mr. Allison pointed out very clearly in his presentation. That we have just had this short-term policies that have continued to build on each other to the point that we're really taking away any ability that we have to offer any incentive to the economy, because we put ourselves in such a deficit situation, and trying to be creative in taxes without causing a breakdown in government services. There's some tough decisions. It's just like with our own budgets at home. If we're going to purchase that new boat, we're going to have to sacrifice something else in our budget. You just can't keep having it all unless you want to keep printing money, and we can have a conversation about that too.
Yeah. Our last couple of shows before you came on were about just the arithmetic of fiscal policy and where that's headed. It seems like a mathematical certainty that we're headed towards either dealing with some really big issues or just bankruptcy. When you look out at the fiscal picture, how much government has grown and how big the deficits have gotten, 3 years in a row of $1 trillion or more in deficit. So it doesn't seem like these problems are going to go away. They're in fact going to get a lot worse. Near the end of your piece, you mentioned it just a little while ago too, growing up in the 1980s, you end on a somewhat high note with Ronald Reagan and this need to just start saying maybe government is the problem again. Are you hopeful that some of the recent political momentum for the Tea Party and frustration with Washington, D.C. is kind of breeding that moment again, another Reagan moment?
Well, of all the things that Reagan, I think, put forward was, at least from, and I speak as a teenager of the 80s, so I kind of saw the response, my parents' response and others' response during that time, is that, I hate to use the word collectivism, but really what you felt coming out of the 70s was this collectivism, this feeling that unions really active, and then we saw what happened to the economy there. It was like the most major part of the Reagan Revolution was empowering the individual. I think people finally felt like that. We can go out and we can accomplish and we can do things, and I think that's where we are right now. Is we need someone that can kind of lift the spirits of the consumer, so that the consumer is confident that things are going to get better, that they can begin to spend money, invest money. And then Reagan also preached the message that I thought was very important, was that a shrinking government. That was very positively received by those who had, from environmental regulations and others, and from the corporate side, that were feeling that pressure, and also holding tight to making important decisions because you didn't know what was coming next. So I think that I'm hopeful that something will happen this election that will allow people to feel more empowered, that we've become too dependent. I want the individual to feel empowered, that they can actually make a difference. And so that's why, kind of coming back to the reason that I wrote it, was I hope that we haven't, through the years, made government ingrained so deeply in the individual that they do not feel the power themselves to dictate their own future. And so as we move forward, I hope in these coming years it's going to be imperative that we try to empower the individual, but also looking at simply the size and scope of government again. I'm a pretty strict constitutionalist. I feel very strongly that that's a strong document, and it's made our democracy what it is today. But we've managed to take something that was built on empowering the individual and turn it into a document that then, to me, is more collectivism and directing the masses of the American population. So I think it's important that for the business community, for the economy as a whole, that we begin to empower the individual again.
You mentioned, I'm not a product of the 1980s. I was born in the late 70s, so I remember Michael Jackson, and that's about it. But your mention of collectivism got me thinking about Jimmy Carter and his energy policy of wearing sweaters and then having the Boy Scouts go door to door to make sure your thermostat was at the right setting.
Right.
That's the kind of crazy collectivism that you can sometimes get when things are being poorly managed and you have the wrong ideas in power. Reagan also was a champion of supply-side economics. Would you call yourself a supply-sider? And what does that mean to our viewers who maybe don't have a strong background in economics?
When I try to teach supply-side economics to my students, I always focus on the individual. Really, it's a macroeconomic theory that is keyed on believing in the power of the individual to make decisions that, of course, spur greater economic growth, because you're freeing the power of the individual. And really, it's on three pieces. It's tax policy, it's monetary policy, and it's regulatory policy. And all three of those pieces really combine to reducing the marginal tax rate for individuals so that they have a greater propensity to work rather than to have leisure time, so they can invest and have more, general economic activity from that standpoint. Monetary policy, there's different there's different supply siders but in essence, that the Federal Reserve policies, by having the powers to restrict or not enough money, not enough liquidity in the economy, or putting too much liquidity in the economy and causing inflation. And then from a regulatory policy is really reducing the role of government regulation so that you do free the market to make decisions. And when you're talking energy policy, it's so important when you look at the billions and billions of dollars that you have to invest, that you have some understanding of where you're going to be 30 years from now. It'd be no different than, an individual making an investment of the mortgage. I'd like to know, the environment, that if I know 15 years from now they're going to change all the rules of insulation and the type of material I have as a roof material on my home that's going to cost me an additional $100,000 to fit my home to the energy standards. That's a big decision, and you need to know at least some predictability of how that will take place. So I consider myself a supply sider, but really more so because I feel like it does free the individual. I believe the individual is the greatest measurement we have of economic activity. And so I've always felt very strongly about, the work of LAFR and others. I think it is.
Yeah, it seems like people still don't quite get it when you see some of the current policy debates. Any discussion of revenue, according to the Democrats, must mean a tax increase. And I always think of supply side economics as a theory that says you can have your cake and eat it too. You could cut tax rates like Herman Cain is talking about and actually get a big bump in revenue because it encourages this individual incentive to work. When your marginal tax rate is 40%, you're not real inclined to work. Whereas if it's 10%, like he's talking 9%, it may increase one's labor effort significantly and encourage them to actually report their income too.
Well, when you look back on the 80s, every economist out there said David Stockman was wrong, and supply side didn't pay off, didn't work. But what supply side did at that point in time is very similar to what we're experiencing right now. Is even though some of could the Reagan administration have cut back on spending? Sure. I mean, there are things that could have happened, I believe, that would have helped the situation. But I do believe that policy helped free the individual to think that they had the opportunity to move the economy forward through their own actions, not by waiting for government to shepherd them along to the next opportunity. So even though supply side economics, I'm sure there's many economists out there say it was just a complete failure, but the piece that I found most important was that what it meant to the individual.
Let's turn to Alabama. You're someone who's an expert in regional and local economic development. Would you say that Alabama is suffering from the same symptoms we're seeing at the national level when it comes to this servitude that you describe in your piece? Are people here tending to become more dependent on government? Are we looking at major investment projects not in how they relate to being a good, sensible decision for a private investor, but instead what we can do to attract him through taxpayer dollars and whatnot? How do you see things, having been in Alabama most of your life, and how it relates to the national picture?
Well, in living in North Dakota and living in Alabama, I'm a native of Alabama but lived in North Dakota for a while, so you have clearly two different mentalities when you have, I think you have a very, the North Dakotan was one that was, very save conscious, and we've seen it in these tough economic times of how, the state of North Dakota has performed very well. They actually had budget surplus the past 2 or 3
lowest unemployment
years.
rate in the country.
So, they're a people that was really built on a farm mentality, and so you're saving for a rainy day. You're putting some things back, and when the Alabama, my experience in Alabama was we've always been, since the 1930s, and even in Mississippi, balanced agriculture with industry that was recruiting industry to the communities, that we have become less of that agricultural past that maybe we've had and more on industry dependent. So it does create two different models to compare. I do believe the Alabama citizen is more of, I think they act on the individual basis. I think they feel empowered to act. And that's maybe the Southerner in general, maybe a little bit more independent. I feel like where we are economically in Alabama is I always find this discussion interesting when I hear people talk about, when I talk policy with people, particularly since I'm more on the supply side of when we look at what we do for industry. I mean, when we recruit new industry to the state, what are we trying to do? I mean, we are basically cutting back, your 10-year tax abatements, and you're moving government out of the way in order to recruit industries to these towns. So in many ways, we are encouraging that, empowering the company in order to support economic development projects. So some of the pieces that may be taxpayer dollars that we're offering and incentives, really some of it are just tax breaks that you're adding a value to that would have been paid. So it's not, we're really freeing the company in many ways. I'll tell you this, and this is something I think is a lesson learned through the years, is that why would a company locate in Alabama? I mean, and you ask any community in this state, and they're going to tell you, well, they're coming to my town because they love it. They love they love the schools. They love all these pieces that go into the community. But the truth of the matter is that a company locates in a location because that's where they can be the most profitable.
Mm-hmm.
And many times we lose that in the equation of it's about us as a community, when in reality it's about the business and making that business profitable for a long-term investment. So, the economic development success we've had in Alabama has been wonderful for our state. There's no question about it. But I think many times we look at it as a reflection of maybe the like of a community rather than the profitability of a company. So you have to, keep that in perspective so that when you see things of, the corporations being the enemy, they're the ones supplying the jobs in the communities. They're making a difference in the community. Mm-hmm. So it goes, if you're against profitable corporations, then you're against jobs, So I think that's important for the people of any state to understand.
I want to make sure to leave a little time to ask you questions about life as a dean in your new job, just a couple in relation to the topics we've been discussing. But what would be your silver bullet solution to the new servitude that we've been talking about? I mean, how do you crack this cycle of people becoming more and more dependent, having more of an attitude, a collectivist attitude as you described it, this attitude, what can the government do for me? How do you shake that up? If you could just go and wave a wand and do something, what would it be?
I think the first thing I would do is to wave a wand that makes the people understand that we have a problem. Mm-hmm. Anytime that you can have government, if I had a choice of government spending or me spending, I would much rather have control of my own destiny in terms of my expenditures and my budget at home or however my personal life may be. I think we have those that are out there now that truly believe that government has solutions, better solutions than the individual. And so I don't know if it's self-confidence or I think the first silver bullet would be we have a problem. So if we could get the people to understand that, yes, we have a problem, then maybe we could move on to policies that could correct those. And the other is if I could make a bullet to make it painless, that would be great. Yeah. But the truth is we're going to have to experience some tough times somewhere. And it's not, we can't keep putting it into the future. We've had short-term policies that have compiled over time. So now we need some short-term policies that cause some pain for a little while so that hopefully we can come out of it stronger than we were before.
Your article's brilliant because you kind of describe how we've been living as a druggie, essentially, right. And what you need to do for someone who's really addicted is just cut them off cold turkey and right. Get them on a new trajectory, essentially. And that seems to be what you're indicating. It's almost like the alcoholic steps. Admit you have a problem,
right.
And then, stop
we could
what you're doing.
We could use a 12-step process in this, but it's something that we must do, Scott. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have children, I have children, and their future is dependent on what we do now. Yeah. And so it's just so important for us, even as educators, no matter if it's kindergarten, whatever age you're teaching, that we have to empower the individual because that's what our country was built on. And I think for the future, it will always be built on empowering the individual. When we lose sight of that, we become just like the rest of the world. We don't become the society that innovates, that continues to try to push the boundary in technology. Because all those are built around individuals, just like Steve Jobs. I mean, with his passing, to me, it just shows the power of what one person can do in trying to, not just their own personal worth, but to using their personal passions to change the lives of other people. And so that says so much for what an individual can do for society.
We have just a few minutes left. You're somewhat of a unique bird, a rare bird, in that you're a pretty strong free enterpriser who's in a position where you can have a lot of influence, dean of a pretty large business school and an up-and-coming business school. How does that inform what you're trying to do with the college? Your ideas about the individual in relation to the collective. Does it lead to a focus on ethics, a focus on free enterprise in the curriculum? Are you trying to put a label on what a business degree at Troy is that kind of reflects your values a little bit?
Well, I'll tell you something that motivated me is one of my first academic jobs. My next door neighbor was a philosophy professor. His name's Jack Weinstein, and he was a pretty strong liberal, but he was a specialist on Adam Smith. And he wrote a small pamphlet on Adam Smith that basically, dismissed the wealth of nations in a way that said, it's been used for pure capitalism. And one of the pieces to that I think is so important is, and I agreed with Jack in this point, was to understand the power of capitalism. A lot of Adam Smith's work was based on the theory of moral sentiments. And the key to that book was ethical behavior. And so I believe that in this time we've seen with these Wall Street protests and others, that it's not the company, it's not the profits that are wrong with the world. And we have to make sure that when we educate our business students that ethical business behavior is at the core of everything that our students do. So you can go out and have multi-billion-dollar corporations, and if you operate those in an ethical manner, then it serves society, it serves you, and it carries and sustains through the generations. I think it's very important that we teach our business students the power of capitalism, the power of the individual, but keyed on ethical behavior is so important. And so as business dean, no matter if we're in accounting or if we're in marketing, teaching our students ethical behavior is at the forefront of what I think is important for us to do.
Certainly seems important post-2008 as well, when you get into some of the ethical judgments of policymakers in who do we rescue, how much do we intervene, and what kind of calculations they were making in relation to the taxpayer. They clearly were siding on the side of bankers and key financial players at the expense of all of us in the long run.
Right.
I want to thank you. We're just about out of time, but thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks for your continued leadership of the business school.
Well, let me thank you for the Johnson Center. Well,
Sure.
I'm extremely proud of the Johnson Center. I'm proud of our faculty.
Thanks.
And I think you're doing a wonderful job, and I think it'll be a great asset for Troy University in the future.
Thank you. Finally, let me thank you all for tuning in. On our next broadcast, Robert Lawson from SMU, Southern Methodist University, will be joining us talking about economic freedom. He's one of the architects of the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and it should be a really great show and a nice transition to the show that we just completed. Good night.